The faults in our genes is not so much a concept but a reality, but frankly, it's how you look at it that determines if it's an actual fault instead of a design plan. Sort of like how in games, bugs become part of the gaming experience. Genetic issues are just a fact of life. If you don't believe that, think to yourself, if everything was immortal and nothing changed, then how could life adapt? How could things evolve out of their current state into potentially something better than they once were? For anything new to come about, it requires the destruction of the previous version, which by perspective of that previous iteration would be pretty terrible. Due to the genetic instability that exists in varying degrees of specifically humans and really everything else on this planet, changes take place over millions of years as a species will adapt to its environment to become better, or in some cases worse, suited to its environments, with the latter meeting their end quickly as a result. But that's what we are used to seeing on this planet. Things slowly change over time. But what happens when something begins messing with the genetic coding of creatures on a more individual basis? How would we react if genetic profiles begin to be blended with what's around it due to an outside influence apart from its native environment? If you answered in abject terror, then you are correct. As a meteorite touches down, hitting a lighthouse, and it's a meteorite because it has the right stuff to make it through the atmosphere and hit the ground, meteors burn up in the atmosphere, and meteoroids are still in space. A shimmering in that area around the lighthouse would begin. As it slowly spread outwards from there, it would become apparent something was very wrong, or right, depending on who you ask, about this material. The light was twisted and refracted in ways. Radio signals would be scrambled, and people who were in lost months of their lives concerning time and began changing. The animals that were trapped within became complete monsters. But what exactly is happening to these plants and animals that were exposed to the shimmer? Well, let's find out in today's episode. But before getting there, first, I want to thank you guys as always for watching and subscribing. It was like a complete crawl from 600k to 700k, and I was actually getting concerned that people were like not enjoying the content as much. But being up to 820k after just reaching 800k a couple of weeks ago, I really do appreciate you guys watching and interacting with me, as well as with these videos. Also, I've started posting actual real-life horror stories over at Roanoke Tales instead of just creepypastas only. So it's like things that I research and look up if anybody's interested in that. Still getting my footing on it, so kind of bear with me. But I'm always interested in feedback if you guys want to check it out after this. It's a video over why so many people just get completely got in Lake Lanier in the great state of Georgia. Anyhow, let's get to it. So we kick off our story with a woman in her room as everyone is standing around her in BSL-4 suits, questioning her. He wants to know what she ate. They had rations for about 2 weeks, but they were gone for over 4 months, which she doesn't remember. By her recollection, she was only there for maybe a few days or possibly weeks, but not that long. But definitely not as long as he's suggesting. He goes on to ask her what happened to most of her team, but she still has no clue, but confirms that one of them is in fact 6 feet under. He asks her, what does she know, which apparently is not very much. We then get the Thing-style meteorite hitting Earth and crashing directly into a lighthouse as material begins to spread outward, and now it's time for Annihilation. Jumping over to a cell undergoing mitosis as Professor Lena talks about how one cell comes from another cell and all those cells came from the first cell. I'm thinking we must be in Biology 101, but here I remember college, there being a lot more, hungover freshmen in that class. They are observing a tumor cell and we'll be discussing autophagic activity, which is actually pretty fun. No, seriously it is. It's also good for your body too. But moving on. As Lena walks out of class, Dan comes over to talk to her. He invites her over for a barbecue that he and his wife are having, but she declines, saying that she is painting the bedroom. Man, what Saturday plans? We get some exposition about how it's been a year, and it's not an insult to his memory, but I gotta be honest here, there's a living insult to his memory that we learn of later that's a huge bra moment. Anyhow, she continues to decline this nerd's barbecue and walks off. We now get the most anemic song in existence. I know you got, I can't play it for you because this will get copyrighted into oblivion, but go watch this movie and just listen to this song. So she hangs out in her house remembering her husband. She goes on and then starts painting the bedroom, and I really hope she's putting kills down, otherwise that's gonna take several coats. But who's this downstairs? Oh my God, it's her husband. He just randomly shows up and it's not like a hallucination like I thought it was gonna be. But she questions Kane downstairs, like where he's been and what he's been doing and why he's been gone so long. But he has no idea of why he's even there, what he's even supposed to be doing. It's clear Kane has some form of memory loss or something else is up. But again, the dude has literally no idea what's happening, so she just continues to ask him fruitlessly. She then asks him how he got there, which he says he was just outside the door and saw her and recognized her. Thinking a psych evaluation might be on the next chopping block list here, but he then takes a sip of water and blood pools into it, and he says he doesn't feel well. So now it's ambulance time. As they're transporting him, she's all over him, which bugged the crap out of me after doing my third riders for EMT school. First off, the paramedic or AEMT is going to be sitting in that little chair behind him, not next to him usually, considering he's got some form of internal bleeding. Second, he's not going to be just watching the patient, just hanging out calling stuff in. He would be pulling Lena away to, like administer aid and actively help the dying patient, whether that be with air or drugs. Like, bro, what is even happening back there? Anyway, so Lena takes over the job of being the actual EMT here, just not very well because she's not trained in it. The ambulance then gets tailed by unmarked cars with lights and sirens. Confused, the ambulance pulls over or really just gets run off the road as they take Kane and Lena. Kane ain't looking so hot at this point, and Lena gets a shot to the neck, and now they're headed to Area X. Waking up in a government facility room, which is always a good feeling, she goes and throws up because the medication used on her apparently gives you a hangover, which sucks because all the pain, none of the fun. The psychologist walks in and begins questioning her as Lena begins questioning back. She asks her when Kane got back home, but Lena really has no information on any of this as he just got there. The psychologist says Kane is here, but he's extremely ill. And Lena says that she can help him, which is a pretty bold statement, but hey, give it a shot. So, they take her outside and show her the Shimmer, which is what they are dealing with. Meeting back inside, they don't know what it is. A religious event, an extraterrestrial event, a higher dimension, all theories but little information. It started about 3 years ago as the Shimmer spread out from there. Everyone and anything that they send in there does not come back. They evacuated surrounding towns, but in 3 months, it'll be where they are now, which it appears to be moving rather slow if it's taken 3 years for it to get this far. So I'm thinking it's time to go to the moon. But eventually it will reach other towns and cities, and it's going to completely encompass the globe, changing everything. So they need to figure out what this thing is before that happens. Kane is apparently the first to ever have come back, and that caught their attention. We then get a flashback to Lena and Kane hanging out, talking about God and the genetic faults in our genes that make us grow old, which to a degree is correct, but again, seems like a feature more than a bug. I don't think our brains in their current states could even handle being immortal, to be honest with you. We could barely handle 70 years of information. So they get frisky as one does, which we now go back to the rooftop eating area. A woman comes over to talk to Lena and invites her back to their table. As they all share beers, they eventually spill the beans to Lena that they're going into the Shimmer with the psychologist from earlier. So we have a physicist, law enforcement, and I think EMT as well, another scientist, she doesn't really talk about what she does, and we all know we are about to have the most alpha Chad division of science going in as well, the biologist, and that's Lena. Look, I don't make the rules, I just enforce them. They continue talking about what happens in there, but really nobody has any clue, so they're next to be sent in to try to discover what it is, as only military and men have been sent in, so why not send a different archetype of person to see if they fare any better? Lena then goes to see Kane and talk to his unconscious body, which after she does, she goes to Dr. Ventress to say that she wants in on the mission. She questions Dr. Ventress about why she's even going in there, to which she responds she's been sending people in there and they don't return, but she's also leaving something major out, so there's only so long that she could do that before she needs to see what's in there as well. I mean, I totally get that, but she's also going in there for her own motives because she has cancer, so she doesn't really have that much time left anyways. So Lena then joins the mission officially, which the men from earlier in the room continue to question her, which then she extrapolates on. Moving towards the Shimmer, it do be shimmering. Looking like my driveway after a rainstorm when the Impala's been parked outside. That 350 is a hybrid, you know. She burns as much oil as she does gas. Leaks too. Thank God I'm getting that replaced as I type this. LS3. Modern muscle, modern engine, modern-ish MPG, I guess. Anyways, I still need to re-gear it, but I'm getting sidetracked. So we see Lena doing the horizontal mambo with, wait a minute, is that Dan? Oh. Ah, well. But then Lena then wakes up in a tent with literally zero memory of how she got there. Heading out, it looks like a rainforest in there. It's very pretty, but the rest of the group is up and talking as well. Lena says she's a little disorientated as somebody tries to talk to her, to which Thorensen says, join the club as nobody can remember setting up camp. Literally, nobody remembers anything after reaching the tree line, but they have food missing that would imply that they were walking around for 3 or 4 days. Radek confirms that they're getting no signals from anywhere else, to which Dr. Venture says, did we ever expect it to begin with? And also their compass doesn't work. But Shepard is mega based and knows that if you point your hour hand at the sun and then split the difference between 12 and 2, that apparently that's south. I've never heard this before, but then again, I'm not a navigator, so somebody tell me in the comments if that's actually true, because that's pretty good information to remember. So they will head south towards the ocean and then follow the beach out of the Shimmer, as now they're just trying to get out of there. So the trek through the woods continues. As they walk along, a lot of foliage has grown up around the area, but what's more interesting is, as they walk through, flowers appear in all different forms from the same vine. Based on what Lena is seeing, She suggests that they aren't even seeing the same species that are all growing together. And that's going to be important in about 30 seconds. It appears there is like a blending of genetics, and not just in a Mendelian way, but instead it's almost pathological. It looks pretty in flowers, but would be pretty horrifying in humans. As Radek walks into the house, Thorsten then finds a boat, and Radek walks back outside, which I gotta tell you, that's a pretty cool last name, but as she goes to say it's abandoned, she gets pulled in by something. They run in to help her as Lena jumps into the swamp water to pull her out. They get her and then drag her outside as something breaks through the house, and it's a giant gator. It makes its way up onto land as they open up on it, as Lena is able to take it out, as then it decides it's had enough and then takes a nice nap. So they start kind of examining the thing. They open up its maw to find that it has concentric rows of teeth, which gators should not have. Ventress suggests that it's a crossbreed, but you can't breed species like that. And these aren't even the same species. These are different classes of animal in our classification systems, which I'll kind of go over here in a little bit. But at best, you can maybe breed like a tiger and a lion to make a liger, or a donkey and a zebra, but only because those species are close enough, and even then, a lot of them are going to be sterile. But due to the concentric rows, the gator has been crossed with the shark, which obviously you're definitely not doing, and yet the creature is still viable. But this also explains why it was so aggressive and continued to chase them up on land. It likely wasn't just hungry. In fact, gators will come up on land, I mean, if you're close enough to the water, but if you back away, they kind of just leave you alone. Or you can just smack them with a shovel and they'll run off. But this one was like, it had their number. So that would probably be the shark aggression. But Lena then tells the group questioning her, the mutations grew more out of control as they got closer to the lighthouse, with duplicates arising, which she says were like echoes from the previous animal. This implies large strings of genetic coding would be incorporated into the surviving animal's body, but this duplicate is just something else entirely. The man then asks if these were hallucinations, which is a valid question given what we will learn later. As the group paddles through the water, Lena checks the bruise on her arm, as they are also moving way too fast for be paddling that slow. They talk about Kane, which Lena says he was KIA despite him being back at that foundation. Her and Shepard talk about the team and how they've either lost someone or have no family, or there's some shared issue amongst them like Dr. Ventress's cancer. They then approach Fort Amaya in the distance. This was the headquarters originally, but the Shimmer swallowed it up. Lena spots growths on the wall that look more like tumors than anything else, which that's not boding well. Entering the fort, they decide to set up shop there and then find evidence that others have actually been in there, likely the men who were sent in this area earlier. Lena finds Kane's name, which she then deduces that the men were watching the fences, so maybe they should too. They then find a plastic bag with the words, "For those that follow." It's a memory card, so they decide to watch it. It shows Kane and one of his men as he exposes the rectus abdominis to the flashlight, and you guys, I'm sorry, you can't see this because I will get just completely demonetized, but I'm going to explain it to you. His intestines are twisting in and out as if they are worms or snakes. Things are not looking too good here, so Thornton then has a freak out over this as they continue to search the area. As they do, they find two guys just completely glued to the wall, looking like a scene out of the new hit and upcoming Last of Us live action. And I've actually kind of maybe heard it's not bad, so if you've seen it, let me know, because God help me, anything's better than The Last of Us 2. There's gonna be so many butthurt people. Look, if you like The Last of Us 2, it's okay. You're allowed to like what you like. I just didn't like it. So we'll see what happens. Anyways, it's two dudes glued to the wall by the same cancer that has been growing on the other walls. So again, that's really not a good sign. This freaks out Radek, who says now they have to get out of there. But then we jump to a flashback of Lena and Kane. They were going to drive out into the country, which sounds incredibly lame. I'm not gonna lie to you. Thank God my wife is not like this. He has to go right now for a mission when really he's just gonna go get a beer or something because he does not want to drive out to the country, so he nopes out of there. That night, Lena then wakes up and checks her blood cells. That's also not good. As the daughter cell splits away from the original cell, it has a shimmer to it, indicating that she's changing over time as well. As she heads outside to survey the area, she heads over to the guard shack to Dr. Ventress. They look at the map, to which Ventress says that they should head to the small town tomorrow that they evacuated that was relatively close to the lighthouse. Ventress questions Lena why she didn't say anything about Kane, but then after seeing the footage, it makes sense. The good doctor then goes on to explain the difference between sewer slides, and you know what I'm talking about, and self-destruction. Almost nobody takes a trip down the sewer slide, but almost everyone self-destructs. Drinking, smoking, gambling, making decisions that disrupt the status quo of your life, like hooking up with Dan for instance, everyone does it. Not everyone hooks up with Dan though. So it's sort of like our cells that self-destruct, we are just a macro expression of a micro phenomena. Ventress says self-destruction is encoded into all of us as they hear something break through the fence. Shepard then gets grabbed by something and taken into the woods. They all take off to run after her, but the screaming stops, that's maximum oof. Which imagine saying maximum oof in 2023. The next morning, the rest of the group packs up and talks about leaving as they had been attacked twice. Which, you have a force multiplier for a reason. I mean, they weren't just there for funsies. And they have lost one of their own. Yeah, so has like everyone else. Dr. Ventress says that they need to keep moving as then they haven't even reached the lighthouse yet. You see, I agree with her. You're here for a reason. Not just, oh, it's not as easy as I thought it was going to be, time to leave. Thorson then gets upset by this, but Dr. Ventress just sort of walks off, letting them decide for themselves. Lena says that, they're right. They should be getting out of there, but they are 6 days away from the edge of the woods where they came in, but only 2 days away from the post. It makes more sense to keep going. Lena says that she believes the coast is the best way out, but again, Thorson is losing it. Tiptoeing through the tulips, crossed with maple trees, crossed with field grass, crossed with other field mice, they end up finding, I don't know, I think that's a boot with a foot in it. I gotta be honest with you, I can't really tell what it is. Lena says that, well, she could still be alive. Okay, bro, sure. But Dr. Ventress says, I think that's highly doubtful, and agreed. So, they need to know, but Lena goes off on her own to, no safety in numbers sort of deal, figure out what's going on with Shepard. Also, if you aren't picking up sort of the religious themes here, this is sort of like the Garden of Eden, when Eve went off on her own and ate from the tree of knowledge sort of deal. There's a lot of like parallels between life and this movie itself, religion and all that, but mainly I'm here for the science specifically on this. But I have to say, it was a really good movie, and I loved a lot of the hidden meanings behind stuff, and I mean, I probably missed some too. I'd recommend giving it a watch. As Lena walks along, she spots a deer who is in perfect sync with another, as they then spot her and run off. That's going to be important later as well. Moving through, well, she spots Shepard and she's donezo. That's going to have to be a little bit of a blur screen over her neck. Heading back to the group, she reports what happened and they continue moving on. What's interesting is she wasn't eaten. Heading to town, that's been evacuated and everything is way more overgrown than 3 years would suggest. But as they move through, they find a group of plants in human form. And apparently, they grew that way. Gonna have to probably say not. Radek seems to understand at this point what's happening. At first, she thought the radio waves were blocked, which is why nobody could communicate. But they aren't blocked, they're just refracted. It's all there, it's just scrambled. If they genetically sequence the leaves that are in human form, she says that they would likely get human Hox genes. Basically, these genes are responsible for the body plan of humans and how we look. So, with the plants, that's why they are human. They are basically using Hox genes instead of their naturally occurring DNA to build structures that they need, or at least that's what they think. Lena goes on to say that's literally not possible, which I agree, but if it's right in front of you and it's happening right in front of you, it's happening. And their own DNA is likely being affected as well, which is kind of a horrifying realization. So here's something interesting though. You see how things are like mimicking each other, and Lena mentioned earlier about duplicates? If you look at this house that they enter, it's exactly like her home. The stairs, the table in the background, the opening, which if you remember what Kane said earlier, he recognized this place, so he came in. So where's Kane from? Who knows? That's the fun. As they walk through, Thornton begins looking at her fingers and gets freaked out as she glares at Lena. That night, Lena gets up once again and takes her own blood to see what's going on. The parent cell is now the shimmering, as it has another shimmering blood cell. Then they get a flashback of Dan the Can Man and Lena. So here's something that I completely cannot stand with any ounce of my body, and it is people who cheat. It's disgusting. You're lame. So basically, they start talking about them hooking up, and she now regrets about cheating on her husband after the fact. And then she tries to take like the moral high ground, and Dan's talking about that he loves her and loves his family, and she's like, "Reed, you forgot about your wife. Bro, you cheated. Don't turn this around and absolve yourself of it." She tells Dan to go because Kane has figured out that they were cheating with each other, and she hates Dan for it. I really hate Lena at this point. So Thorson then wakes Lena up and she gets knocked out, which, I don't know. I'm not saying you deserve to be knocked out, but if you're having a dream about making the other person out to be the bad person for cheating when you're the one cheating, maybe you deserve to, get butted in the face. I don't know. But all three of them wake up tied to a chair as Thornton found Lena's locket with Kane, so that ties her to this area. She now questions how long they knew. Now here, I think she's just losing it because they all know about this area. She's under the impression she was somehow kept out of the loop of some information, but she volunteered for this position. Again, I don't really get what point she's trying to make, as this was all her choice. Nobody knows anything that's going on. She was given the exact same information, and she really doesn't need to be having this freak out right here, but like I said, her brain's probably a little scrambled at this point. But that's really the only explanation I have for this. Anyway, Thornton goes on to say she never saw a bear take out Cass. Yeah, because she wasn't there. And everything is hinging on Lena's word. And also Dr. Ventress, who said it was a bear. I don't know. And apparently Lena's a liar because she knew who Kane was. Like, why is it a crime for you to have your husband in the military and he got sent out here for this dangerous mission, and then she shows up looking for her? Like, these are normal events, right? But then again, human consciousness is refracted. This is such a dumb part. Anyways, I guess fear also is what's making her do this, because she looked at her fingerprints and saw them move. So she starts questioning if her insides are going to move like the fingerprints, but she's going to have to cut them open like that person did. And so she hears Shepard yell for help at this point, which, just getting back to the original point, I mean, yeah, probably. So what? Your intestines are going to move a little bit. It's not that big of a deal. Anyway, so she heads in there as a bear growls and Thorson stops talking. The bear moves into the room as they all sit there. Interestingly, as it growls, it starts yelling, "Help me." And remember, it tore out Shepard's throat, which that information for the vocal cords was in the area, which then altered the bear. The bear has also altered to a degree as it appears quasi-human in the face. And Thorson comes over and opens up on it, but then gets totally got. Can't show that. That's gonna have to be a little bit of a blur over its face. And then it attacks Lena, but Radek is able to take it out before it ends all of them. So that Thornton issue kind of resolved itself pretty quickly, but Dr. Ventress starts getting her stuff together. She says they are disintegrating their bodies as fast as their minds, which is agreed. Y'all are not doing so hot. The next morning, Lena and Radek head outside. Lena goes up to Radek and says they should go. They discuss what's happening at this point. Lena says the refractions have affected her, so it's affected all of them. Then the bear took on the last part of Shepard, and she's also developing plant growth on her arm. Everything's not good. As she begins walking through the woods, it's sort of like a surreal kind of peaceful thing, but Lena loses her behind some bush, but then comes out to an area where there were people walking everywhere and they've all turned into plants, so Radek is gone. They continue questioning Lena, asking her, well, then how did she survive? To which we get the anemic song once more. God, I hate this song. While Lena and Kane are on the couch with him looking at her like, bruh, are you cheating? So Lena has a good cry in the woods and then keeps moving. Finally, she reaches the coast, drops her gear, and then heads through, moving past some of the crystalline trees and plants, basically prism trees. Heading towards the lighthouse, things apparently went pretty bad here as bones are laid out in patterns. Moving inside, she spots a hole in the ground where the meteorite had struck through, and then sees a burned body on the left sitting cross-legged with the camera pointing at it. Heading over to watch it, she sees the bones were already there whenever the camera got there as well, but then it's her husband Kane. Also, his name is Cain, like Adam's son. See, connections to religion. And that thing sitting in the basement, or hell, is corrupting the Garden of Eden, or life as we know it, into something else, kind of like Lucifer. It's all there. So continuing to watch, Cain is sitting on the ground, talking to the camera as he is speaking in fractured memories and sentences that are basically a word salad as his brain is going. He then takes a phosphorus force detonator and tells them to find Lena and tell her that he loves her, and then basically pulls the pin and counts to what? And then a man walks up, and it's also Cain, the Cain that came to see her in her home. Shutting the camera, she heads to the hole in the ground. Just sitting down inside, the thing went pretty deep into that ground. She then finds Dr. Ventress down there. She says it's the last phase before she vanishes into the havoc. She's kind of speaking in riddles as well. She asks her what they spoke of and that she needed to find what's inside of the lighthouse and that it's also inside of her. She says it's unlike them. She says she doesn't know if it wants it all or if it just grows and fragments their minds, which results in annihilation, as she turns into just a bunch of light material floating around the room. I'm telling you, this won't be good for the economy if it gets out. This results in the Thing, beyond human comprehension, appearing before Lena. Some would say a biblical representation of an angel. Looking into its deadlights is never a good thing, and then it sort of takes some of her blood and begins growing it rapidly and uses that information to take on a hominid form. She then goes ape mode on it and open fires, but it approaches her, so she runs upstairs. Ascending the tunnel, it's already up there. It begins mimicking her movements as well, like a reflection more than a refraction, similar to the image, but different. It's essentially a duplication. Getting the creepy TikTok sounds, it lays down next to her as she runs, but then it bear hugs her. The more she pushes against it, the more it pushes against her, until finally she passes out from being hugged too tightly. This causes the thing to pass out too, or at least lay down. So they have a good nap together as the creature gets up with her. So at least a marginal amount of analysis. Much like the deer who had the version of it present, and like the homes paralleling the inside of the Shimmer versus the outside, this thing is paralleling humans as well. Which, if it can do that, the question explains why Cain had another version of himself. What does that mean though exactly? I think the real question is, does it actually have to mean anything at all? It just is. It's kind of like an outside of human comprehension. No motives, no wants or needs, it just exists. And that does, I know, kind of sound like a cop-out, but kind of think of it as coming up with a concept is easier than explaining the concept, right? So if you can conceptualize a dark matter engine that could somehow propel a ship faster than the speed of light, just because you can conceptualize it does not mean you can explain how it works. Because if you could do that, for the love of God, please go tell NASA immediately so we can get off this rock. So it approaches Lena as she starts waltzing with it before picking up a phosphorus concussive detonator. She hands it to the creature and it begins taking on her form as the genetic material needed is now incorporated. She hands it the round as it detonates, but it seems kind of unfazed by this and goes back to the body on the ground. Touching it, it now has feelings for it, or it always had feelings for it, and then touching the material around it, it ignites it, which then results in all of it burning. Crawling back to the source itself, it lights everything on fire, which you may be confused by this one, but I'll explain in a second. As it burns everything down, all the shimmering effects created around it also begin to dissipate as the shimmer itself falls away and everything kind of goes back to normal. Back at the powwow being held, they suggest it was alien. She continues to not answer any questions about it because she just doesn't know. Lena says it mirrored her because she attacked it, so it was attacking herself. She says it wasn't destroying everything, it was changing everything. They inform Lena, though, that everything was ash, so whatever it was is now gone. Lena then asks what happened to her husband, and apparently after the Shimmer was destroyed, he just randomly stabilized. Heading in there, she realizes it's not actually her husband, but it's actually one of those things. However, seeing as it has all of his genetic info and apparent memories, or at least feelings Cain had, he is attached to her. But what's this? Lena also appears to be altered as her irises are the same as his. So before getting into the science, why did that thing burn down its own area? See, the life that was changing everything was different from the life on this planet to a degree, and there were no faults in its genetic coding. There were no issues with its immortality. It existed because it exists and was perfect as a result. When coming into contact with our planet's genetic coding, or at least the life here, which has a literal self-destruct button encoded into it, it created problems as the coding was not perfect. This created the mutations around it, so when Lena came into contact with her perfect form, DBZ style, it didn't know about self-destruction, but once interacting and absorbing her coding and creating herself, it became aware of its self-destruction. Having read the Bible and being a Christian myself, I can see the similarities being presented, which again isn't a complete reflection but a refraction of the story. You can think of the self-destruction sort of like sin almost. In the Garden of Eden, it did not exist. Man was immortal and nothing bad could ever be conceived, but once Eve and subsequently Adam were tempted to eat from the tree of knowledge, which could be compared to, I suppose, the Shimmer, bad things began to happen. For us, eating from the tree of knowledge would have caused the self-destruction or faults in our genes, which was imperfectness. Which is why religion-wise, we are where we are today as mortals, introducing a perfect organism to our faults, our sin. That being the self-destruction on a cellular level leads to its own destruction, which sort of actually makes humans, like the tree of knowledge, for this own organism's fall. Because of this, by its own choices, it burned down basically everything around it just by existing as a flawed being, which led to the destruction of its own paradise, or its Garden of Eden as a result. You could think of it not completely as a mirror reflection, but more, again, as a refraction of what happened in the Bible. Shimmer is the Garden of Eden, where life was made. Humans are the tree of knowledge, the perfect organism that at first just mimics what it was once exposed to, humans. It makes a non-mirror choice that destroys, which, much like our choice, led to our annihilation. Its choice sort of led it to chose to kind of act like man by incorporating our genetic sequences, which makes it part man. And like I said, this movie is pretty interesting, and it's analytically wise, I'm not the strongest person to be asking about what movies mean and their interpretation or anything, but this is what I gleaned from it. And again, the science within is going to be interesting to talk about regardless, so we're about to move on to that. But this part I did find very interesting. But with that, I do have to acknowledge the other accepted concept of what this might be, which is basically planetary cancer. As the comet strikes the planet and begins emitting this mutagenic effect, nothing will self-destruct any longer, sort of like why cancer cells will not undergo apoptosis even after being told to by immune cells, if being found at all. Then over time, it continues to spread until eventually it will overtake the entire planet. So you can think of humanity almost like chemotherapy then, entering the cells, or at least entering the cancer, and ultimately destroying it once getting to the core of where the really badly mutated cells and organisms were. Alright, so you're sitting there, wondering what in the name of all that is holy is going on with the Shimmer itself. How is it actually doing what it does? I think really the way we can identify that, or at least attempt to, is highly based on what it isn't. Now, this had me stumped for quite a while. I ran through down the first line of thought of what I could possibly think it was, and the second and third and fourth. What is causing people to basically turn into this? And here's a few things that we know that it's not. First, this is not organic. While it has an impact on organic creatures, as clearly it's scrambling genes, well, at least to a degree, it's impressing these genes upon the body, and that method by which it affects cells is not going to be like through a vector like a virus, but I believe there still is an intermediary thing going on which is causing the cells to be able to uptake this genetic information because they are being destabilized, and we'll get to that in a moment. Continuing on, they talk about how this is like energy, and energy itself can have profound impacts on the genetic stability of any cell and can render real-world consequences. Look at fire, for instance. It can literally cook cells. Radiation, it can destroy your DNA. UV light, it can cause your DNA to bind up in things called thymine dimers. So bear with me on this, because literally, while I wrote this, I'm still actually feeling out what I believe this to be. This process requires this energy to essentially exist to create a cascade of consequences for genes, but what I do believe is also, for it to be fully successful, it requires the alteration of function within the body as well as on the outside of the body to achieve this splice effect that we have seen. And if that sounds confusing, it was confusing to write, but I'm gonna pretty much cover all this. So as mentioned previously in the movie itself, I went on the side tangent about how you cannot just, combine organisms for funsies. Pig and elephant DNA just won't splice. The results of mixing this DNA will either cause the embryo to terminate, or if it was even possible for the fertilization process to begin, or if the creature even lives to adulthood, then a lot of them will be sterile. And even then, the creatures have to be very closely related on a genus level to produce viable young in the first place. So, they can really only be separated by a handful of a couple of 100,000s of years. So for something like a shark and an alligator to fuse, that would require a lot of things and be very difficult, as they are not even the same class, but the same phylum. So it goes kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, subfamily, genus, species. Notice only some instances of interbreeding naturally can be found in the genus, so that's literally one step above species. But with sharks and alligators being separated by a phylum, that is 6 class orders above. So it's impossible, as we know it with standard biology, for these creatures to interact genetically, which is a good thing, because otherwise we just have a bunch of Cronenberg monsters running around. So take how difficult it would be for these genes to splice into one another, then take that back to literally a different kingdom of life. So with phylums, you're talking hundreds of millions of years, right? Well, with different kingdoms, you're talking like back at the beginning almost. And this Shimmer appears to be capable of causing this to exist. So when they continued to near the lighthouse, the effect got stronger, which led to their bodies changing underneath them. Fingerprints would move, intestines would turn into worms, plants would begin growing under their skin. All this hints at what's happening as the energy from the Shimmer becomes more focused. Then with the bear, we see the largest contributor to this theory that I have on how this would be happening. For genes from a literal different branch of life to begin growing within humans, and for humans growing within it, requires a massive intermediary process to be happening within people. One of the premises that I am running on currently is from what I have seen. Whatever people are touching seems to affect them. Roanoke was touching the plants quite regularly after finding the human-shaped plants, which after she's literally turned into one, all the human-shaped plants were not just grown from human Hox genes, or even with the addition of the entire homeobox genes, which actually is the floor plan for your whole body. In fact, while Hox genes are great at determining what the anterior and posterior of you are going to look like, homeobox genes are in all eukaryotic cells and encode transcription factors that have the basis and knowledge, which is kind of a colloquialism, but that's pretty much what you call it, for our actual shape and complexity of that shape they're in. So again, those plants are shaped like that because people were infected and then just wandered off and became the plants as their cells became a hybrid of animal and plant. We see this with the bear when it tore Shepard's throat out. It came into contact with her genes, and likely the bear had been eating the whole time as well, but we never see it come out of the darkness, so we don't know if it really had any other mutations on it prior to grabbing Shepard. It's clear that once it came into contact with her cells, her genetic information was absorbed to a degree and became part of the bear's genome. The soldier, whose guts were like worms, is also explainable by thinking if you were in there for a year and Lena was really only in there for what she says was like, a week or two, but it was actually 4 months, then by extrapolating that out, it may have been up to 6 weeks that the soldiers were in the Shimmer, which means food would have been running low or would have been completely out by then, causing them to eat naturally occurring animals that were there, and they may have thought inside of the dirt was more safe, so they had possibly eaten worms as a result, and this means that his intestines were changed to incorporate the worm DNA and really be no different than, say, like a bear eating meat of Shepard. So not just exposure to the Shimmer, but exposure to things housed within the Shimmer first, and then your body just recently exposed to the Shimmer seems to be main factors here, which, let's go over the process of events real quick, kind of getting into how I believe people are being altered apart from just DNA absorption. There's, more to it than just that. We haven't even begun to talk about the intermediary portion, which is the most critical, I believe, for this to work. Upon entering the Shimmer, you are clearly more affected the closer you get to the center. This would imply that it works like any other form of energy. The closer you are to the source, the more energy you absorb. This energy does something to your DNA in a way that destabilizes it, and this may imply a few things. Either it is destabilizing it like energy as we know it on and off Earth can do, which is the destruction of the DNA, or it's influencing enzymes themselves to behave in a certain way. And I believe it to be the latter over the former, for the main fact that if it were genetic destruction, Lena would be riddled with cancer along with everybody else by the time they actually even got out. And they would have been dealing with what amounts to radiation sickness in their cells as they became less capable of operating since their coatings were being destroyed. But as we can see, when Lena takes her blood, her body is having no issues continuing the process of survival by mitosis. They're just changing. So this implies that the energy does not destroy, it again just changes. And the best way of changing without destruction is enzymatic activity. If we can assume this, then we can also assume that as time passes, it's a lot like walking into the water in Fallout 3 to talk to the dude about the nuke in the center of Megaton. You can stand far away from it and it may take longer, but you will be changed. Or you can get right up close and personal with it and it'll change you faster. The closer you are, the more chaotic this enzyme activity becomes concerning your DNA. As we know, enzymes work by lowering the activation energy of chemical reactions within the body. I believe this Shimmer is affecting these enzymes in a way which then lowers the threshold for the cell, making typically more controlled actions more readily completed and potentially even random. Overall, this causes the cell to destabilize and may even introduce new functions not previously seen for the overall internal molecular biology because it causes it to shift. A cell's main purpose is to control what's going in and what's going out. While that's difficult concerning things like water, it's more easily done with salts and potential genetic material found in an environment. Typically, a virus is the most recognized way for genetic material to enter another cell from another, but you have to wonder, based on cells as we know them and the acquisition of mitochondria, is it possible something else is going on? Now, stick with me on this. Just like with the movie, it's kind of gonna get out there. Back in the day, it was assumed how we acquired mitochondria was that one cell engulfed another cell and then decided not to destroy it. And to this day, we still have this cell and it's known as a mitochondria. It actually has its own DNA, but over time, being an organelle of a larger cell, it has lost a lot of its functionality and now just serves as the powerhouse. We also have cells in our body that engulf other cells regularly, known as macrophages. I'm sure you all know about that, but the point is, if we come from one sperm cell and one egg cell, that initial coating of 46 chromosomes houses all the information to make you, even with the differentiation of your cells. That means genetically, all of your cells know how to engulf other cells. They know how to move around. Neurons know how to divide like skin cells, and bones know how to produce mucus like the lining of your stomach. but those genes are switched off, allowing for the cell to behave in a certain way that benefits the rest of the organism by doing its job so that another cell does not have to take over that job. So here's what I propose is happening, but even still, it's not the whole picture. The Shimmer has caused those cells to basically remember these other traits that were switched off. That is supported by a couple of things. First, when Thornton mentions how she can see the ridges in her skin moving on her fingertips. Those are not supposed to be moving, as you might know, which means the cells have taken on new traits. Also, the dementia building up in all of them because their brains may literally be having neurons within, behaving like other cells in the body and moving around, breaking connections. They lost 4 days and have complete amnesia, which may have been the initial shift in the brain, basically stopping them from remembering because they're no longer behaving in the way they're supposed to. Again, all of this is to show it's not destruction, it's change, and given enough time, I believe this will literally melt the organism down into the cancerous-like substance we see on the walls as cells become so chaotic, there is no differentiation amongst them anymore, and they go back to basically being a single-celled organism, all because the Shimmer is messing with enzymes. Basically, when everything's different, nothing is different. But I can hear you now. Yes, Roanoke, you have mentioned enzymes several times, and you still have not told us what's happening. Correct. Basically, because this video is an exercise in me trying to figure out what is happening in real time. You're literally watching or listening to the gears turn right now. So, as I write this, it's taking longer than normal because every paragraph I have had to stop and think about how this connects to the next thing that I want to say. I've literally had to throw away several ideas because there's huge flaws in it, and it would ultimately just not make sense, to which this one that I have appears to be on the right track, but still, it's contingent on something in the middle. Life does not exist by itself. Humans love to believe that our brains are kind of in the driver's seat, but really, with the gut microbiome impacting us in such a way that we may as well be operating the gas and brakes while we steer, there's a lot more nuance to life. So for reference, there's about 37.2 trillion human cells, I believe. Funnily enough, there's about 39 trillion bacterial cells. Prokaryotes are much smaller than eukaryotes, typically, so that's the reason why it really only represents about 2 to 6 pounds of your body mass and about a 200-pound person. This comes out to 0.9 to 2.72 kilograms in a 90.7 kilogram person. But there is something in those prokaryotes that is much more readily available than in our cells, and I believe this is absolutely critical to explaining what's happening in our cells. The Shimmer, first and foremost, affects all cells. Plant, animal, fungi, bacterial, it doesn't matter. It's clear it is messing with the internal metabolism and functionality of cells, causing genetic crossover events. And how this may be possible is with it specifically affecting something called a restriction enzyme. Restriction enzymes are found in human cells as well as bacterial cells. Basically cells in general, as well as some tissue, interestingly enough. But its purpose is to cut DNA at specific sequences. Now, this is an incredibly complicated process, and there's a lot more to it than I'm saying here, but the enzyme serves as to cut away some DNA, which leaves a sticky end of that DNA, and from here, DNA ligase will then come in and link genes to this strand. If the strands are matching, then boom, it is able to form a single unbroken molecule of DNA. In things like cloning, ligase is used to insert genes and other pieces of DNA into plasmids specifically. Now, what is a plasmid? Well, it's a circular, free-floating form of DNA that is typically found in prokaryotes. Plasmids are what's typically responsible for things like antibiotic resistance, for example. Now, that's all well and good, but how does that relate to specifically eukaryotes if this is found in prokaryotes? Again, I think it goes back to all the cells becoming undifferentiated, which is leading to engulfing cells. At first, you're still relatively differentiated, right? Your cells still have a job, you're still in a human shape. The longer you stay there, the less differentiated your cells become, which is why you change into things. Due to the amount of naturally occurring bacteria within the body containing these restriction enzymes, I think it may be possible that cells ended up engulfing surrounding bacteria, but unlike macrophages, who have the ability to destroy what they engulf, a lot of cells lacked this capability. So once undergoing this process, they were not able to destroy the bacteria or to properly encase it in a vacuole to keep it contained. What this did was cause the bacteria to fuse with the eukaryotic cell and with it newly acquired genetic information like plasmids. Now, I'm not suggesting that the plasmids are only responsible for these changes that are seen, but I think they have a hand in creating the genetic combinations that we see. As more and more eukaryotic cells engulfed prokaryotic cells, what was happening is the cell itself would begin to change, having these plasmids floating around, with enzymes continuing on as normal with the DNA membrane still intact, dictating to the rest of the cell the standard function of day-to-day life, with some obvious changes basically being brought on by the new influence dictating the outside of the nuclear membrane that ribosomes and original prokaryotic instructions are now affecting. Like again, I know this is getting way out there, but so was the movie. This would cause the cell itself to begin to take on even more strange abilities due to the new incoming information, and one of those is the fact that the cell is now blending eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells. This continues to serve a purpose when we look at how genes are acquired, and this idea, to me at least, would make sense why it ceases after Lena leaves the Shimmer. Prokaryotes in nature do something that eukaryotes, at least when it comes to animals, do not do. Again, they have plasmids and can pick up these plasmids from the environment or genetic fragments from dead prokaryotes. Something to note about that statement is plasmids exist within fungi and higher plants, but not animals. Picking up environmental DNA is definitely a bacterial trait that has made them quite adaptive and successful. And this can be done in two ways. Through the process of conjugation, bacteria will create a tube to transfer plasmids between two living prokaryotes, and this is actually how antibiotic resistance is transferred. The other way, as mentioned previously, is they will absorb free-floating genetic coding that may be beneficial to them, which is a bold strategy if you think about it, picking up the remains of something that already got with a gamble that'll help you. But the functionality is why I believe it is critical to explain the adoption of new genetic information. Judging by what we see with the bear's face covered in shepherd's blood and it going into its mouth, this genetic information was in the environment. If the prokaryote and eukaryote mix of cells were to be present in the bear, which I believe is highly likely considering it was changing, then it would have scooped up this information and brought it into the cell. From here, it is not clearly known if it was brought into just plasmid DNA or if it was transported in the actual human genome, but either way, the cell itself took on some of the characteristics of the cell that it picked up the information from. I'd be more inclined to believe it is outside of the DNA envelope, as the bear cell is still kind of holding strong as a bear, but it is absorbing different characteristics than it is expressing them. But something to note here is that this is just the first generation of these cells. Something else will happen over time, which we will find out is actually critically important, and it'll show kind of like the permanent changes in Lena and why those existed. This process can again be seen with Radek when she touches the leaves and rolls it between her fingers. She is releasing some of the cells onto her skin, then she picks up that genetic information as it moves deeper into her body and enters her blood. Hence why it appeared on her arms first, and then rapidly took over from there. But then, what about the mitosis itself? Well, if you saw during the first mitotic division of Lena's blood cells, at first, it was clearly one of her regular cells. Then there was a Shimmer cell that was different. Then later, it was a Shimmer cell producing another Shimmer cell, indicating that all the cells in her body by this point have been affected by this process. I believe this explains why the process goes from something as simple as minor characteristic changes to completely changing you the longer you're in there. As the cell enters mitosis, one of the critical things, and I keep saying critical, but there's a lot of like very, very important parts, but it's important for you to remember, it's not supposed to be in there. There's not supposed to be plasmids floating around in the eukaryotic animal cell, and the nuclear envelope also dissolves during this process. Upon the membrane falling away, this may now open up the human genetic coding to incorporation of other animals' DNA, because the cell doesn't expect it to be there while undergoing this typical process. It likely happens after the unzipping of the DNA using helicase that basically integrase, finds some DNA, and is like, yo, what's this doing here? And then adds it in, assuming it was just like a broken off piece or kind of damaged, and this now becomes a part of the human genome. Once this happens, things like with the alligator, it's concentric teeth, right? What would happen is the alligator appears to be the aggressor at some point and ate the shark. You may have just found the shark, completely got, who knows? But there was shark blood in there, and that would get into its mouth, and that information would be absorbed, which would eventually inspire the new trait. And it isn't just a surface level. We also see that the alligator itself is white and it looks like shark skin, and it appears more deeply that the alligator's genome was affected because those teeth are now permanent. Now, likely because it's still a part of the Shimmer and it's still in the Shimmer, it can continue to absorb new incoming information until it absorbs some lead. This is how I believe all this is happening. Once you enter the area of effect for the Shimmer, the energy it is releasing causes enzymes in your body to kick it into overdrive, which then may lead to the activation of other genes, causing your cells to basically undifferentiate. Considering the Hox and homeobox genes are brought into this, that would imply it is deeply influencing the human genome and deeply influencing everything's genome. Once this happens, cells pick up new coding that is then accidentally added into the initial coding during mitosis. This leads to a hybrid cell that is no longer a person that's in there. It's really more genetic noise that gets added, leading to a person to become basically a mutation of its original self and fall away from what they once were and become many things versus just one thing. Then, when the Shimmer is destroyed, the cells would go back to normal, or at least a normal operation status. It would likely realize there's DNA in the cytoplasm and then destroy it as it's not supposed to be there. Enzymes would return back to normal activity, and as a result, the cell would return to its standard differentiation. However, the body itself genetically would be forever changed, which would be interesting to see what the long-term effects of this are. But with Lena, we see her eyes shimmer as there still is a change even after the mutation effect has stopped. Her body is going to be forever changed, which means they're going to have like three-headed kids that have shark tails. I don't know. But we finally get just an off-topic, thing that I wanted to discuss. The thing at the very end. If you thought the rest of the video was out there, well, strap in. Looking at this thing, this is completely my opinion, and it's not confirmed, but seeing as Einstein proved that energy is related to mass, there is clearly something going on with this creature. You can think of it as a template of pure energy creating mass. Based on what comes out of Ventress, she went from being, a creature of matter to being one of pure energy. Consciousness is probably lost during this process. And again, if you look at it from like a religious perspective, that's like her soul being released. But if this thing is capable of moving you from mass to energy, then it's not too far-fetched to believe that it may be capable of reversing that equation and moving you from energy to mass. The thing it creates is a physical representation of energy that it is, but it is simply a template. After pulling some blood from Lena, that's when it becomes like her. The stem cells it created now have the human genome in it, which all cells on this planet code for its self-destruction, so it too was coded for that now. Kind of a bad move on its part, to be honest with you. But that's what I believe it is. Obviously, the movie is just insanely open to interpretation as to what's really going on, but I hope at least I kind of adequately shed some light on the cellular process that may be taking place with the gene expressions. But anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be great, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on what I post. I'll drop my Twitter, Roanoke Tales channel, Discord, and Patreon in the channel description if anybody's interested in that. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you once again to our astronaut Wesley A. Weaver Jr. Thanks, man. I'd also like to thank our astrophysicist, Death Dancer and Phoenix, as well as our scientists, Countryside Limbo and Lacune. And the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping everything running. It is always greatly appreciated. Alright, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed. I'll see y'all in the next one.